The valley called it grief. Two men leaned on her fence rail that October morning, hats pushed back, watching her lower another clay barrel into the dirt with a rope and a grunt and a patience that looked, from where they stood, like madness. "Grief does strange things to a woman," the taller one said, not unkindly, spitting into the dust. The other only shook his head and said nothing, which, in that country, was its own kind of verdict. She didn't look up. She had 31 more barrels to bury before the frost, and she'd learned, in the 11 months since they put her husband in the ground, that the sound of men talking about her cost nothing and changed nothing. So she let it pass over her like weather. 9 months later, the same two men stood at that same fence rail. The creeks had gone to cracked clay ribbons. The Halloran place had lost 40 head. The whole valley, from ridge to ridge, lay the color of an old bone, and every man who'd ever owned a plow was on his knees before God, asking why. But past that fence rail, past the woman they'd called broken, the rose ran green. Not pale green, not struggling green. Green like rain had fallen only there. The taller man took his hat off. He didn't put it back on for a long moment. That is where this story ends. Now let it begin at the beginning. Because a harvest like that one doesn't happen by accident, and grief was never the word for what she was doing with those barrels. Before you settle in, I'll ask you one thing, and only the one. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. What town, what country, what corner of the world you've carried into this valley with you. I like to imagine the map filling in while the story runs. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Back before the drought had a name. Back to a woman standing alone at the edge of 110 acres that everyone in the county agreed she couldn't keep. Her name was Adeline Ferris, and she was 34 years old when they buried her husband, Thomas, under the cottonwood at the north fence line, the one tree on the property that gave real shade. He died the ordinary way men died out there, a fever that came on fast in the wet spring and didn't let go. No drama to it, no last words worth repeating. Just 3 days of heat and then quiet. She'd sat with him the whole 3 days. She hadn't cried where anyone could see, and the valley had decided, in its collective and unspoken way, that this meant something was wrong with her. Grief was supposed to look a certain way. Adeline's grief looked like getting up the next morning and feeding the chickens, because the chickens didn't know Thomas was dead and didn't care, and somebody had to feed them. What the valley didn't know, because Adeline never told anyone, was that Thomas had left her 110 acres of land that was mostly worthless and a debt of $600 against it, held by a man named Cyrus Vane, who owned the mercantile in town and half the paper in the county besides. Cyrus was a smooth man, soft-spoken, the kind who called every woman ma'am in a way that made the word sound like a door closing. He'd loaned Thomas the money 2 winters back for seed and a second well that had never been dug, because the well driller took one look at Ferris land and said the water table out there was so far down it wasn't worth his time or her money. And Thomas, God rest him, had spent the money on a bull instead that died of colic within the year. That was the truth of the Ferris place. Bad water, worse luck, and a note coming due. Adeline had exactly $211 to her name when she buried her husband. She had 110 acres of land the well driller had called dry as a preacher's sermon. She had 6 months, by Cyrus Vane's own generous accounting, to make good on the note, or sign the land over to him at whatever price he cared to name, which everyone understood would be low, because everyone understood Cyrus wanted that land for the creek frontage on its eastern edge, water rights that would let him control irrigation for 3 farms downstream of his own holdings. It was not a secret. It was simply how business was done in that valley, and nobody thought it worth commenting on, the way nobody comments on rain. What the valley did comment on, what it commented on for months with real enthusiasm, was what Adeline did with her $211. She didn't buy seed. She didn't buy a mule, though hers had gone lame that spring and never fully recovered. She rode into town on a Tuesday, tied up outside the mercantile in full view of 6 or 7 men who had nothing better to do than watch a widow conduct her business. And she bought 200 clay water jars from old Esteban Vidal, the potter who worked the kiln behind the church and had more unsold jars than he had customers, because in a country with wells and rain barrels, who needed 200 clay jars? She paid him $40 for the lot. $40 for 200 cracked, seconds, and unglazed jars that Esteban himself had been ready to smash for scrap clay. The men outside the mercantile watched her load them into a borrowed wagon, one by one, and by the time she'd made the 3rd trip out to the Ferris place, the story had already made its way around town twice, gathering weight each time it passed a new mouth. The widow's buying pots. Broken pots. $40 of broken pots, when she owes Cyrus Vane $600 and the note's coming due. Grief does strange things. "Not charity," she said once, quietly, to her sister-in-law Beulah, who'd ridden out worried and found Adeline in the yard surrounded by clay jars stacked like a strange orchard. "Not luck either. Just an idea. And I intend to see if it's right before I explain it to anybody who'll only tell me it's wrong." Beulah, who loved her but didn't understand her, had gone home and told her own husband that Adeline had lost her sense along with her husband, and her husband had told 2 other men, and by the following Sunday, the whole congregation had heard some version of it, and Adeline had felt every eye on her back as she walked into church alone in her black dress, chin level, giving none of them the satisfaction of a flinch. Here is what Adeline knew that the valley did not. She had grown up not in that dry country, but 400 miles south of it, in the hill country near the Rio Grande, where her mother's people, Mexican on her mother's side, though Adeline rarely spoke of it in a valley that would not have made that easy for her, had farmed melons and squash on land drier than anything east of the Pecos. Her grandmother, Refugio, had shown her as a girl a trick so old nobody could say where it started, a trick for growing green things in country where rain came twice a year, if it came at all. You buried an unglazed clay jar in the ground beside your plants, filled it with water, and stoppered the neck loosely with a flat stone or a scrap of cloth. The clay was porous. It didn't leak so much as it wept, slow and steady, straight down into the root zone, hour after hour, day after day, releasing exactly as much moisture as the dry soil demanded, and no more. No evaporation off a wide, wet surface, the way a furrow-flooded field lost half its water to the sun before it ever reached a root. No waste. The plant took what it needed, when it needed it, and the jar took 2 weeks to empty, instead of the ground taking 2 days to dry. It was called an olla. Adeline had not thought of the word in 15 years, not since her grandmother died, and her mother had moved the family north to marry a man who did not care for reminders of that side of the family, and the trick had gone dormant in her, the way a seed goes dormant, waiting on conditions. Standing over Thomas's fresh grave with a stack of bills she couldn't pay, and 110 acres of land everyone called dry as ash, the seed had woken up. She did the arithmetic, sitting at her kitchen table by lamp oil, because arithmetic was the one thing grief hadn't touched in her. 200 jars, $40. If she buried them in rows 18 inches from her seedlings, spaced to cover roughly 3 acres of her most fertile bottomland, the ground nearest the dry creek bed, which still held moisture deep down even when the surface baked. She could plant that 3 acres in beans, squash, corn, and a stand of melons, crops that would fail outright under her old furrow and hope method, but that might, with the Oyas feeding them steady and slow, actually finish a season. 3 acres wasn't the whole 110. It was a fraction. But 3 acres, done right, done green when everyone else's ground was dust, might be worth more than the other 107 combined, if the year turned out the way her bones told her it would. Because Adeline had noticed something the men in town had not troubled themselves to notice, being too occupied with their own larger, better-watered acres to study the sky the way a woman with nothing left to lose studies it. The spring rains had come light. The creek that fed the valley's wells was running low even in April, lower than she'd seen it in the 6 years she'd lived there. The old-timers muttered about cycles, but muttering wasn't a plan, and Adeline had decided that whatever else she was going to be a woman with a plan. She buried the first 50 Oyas herself, alone, over 11 days in early May, digging each hole by hand because she couldn't afford to hire it done, and wouldn't have found a hand willing to do it anyway, not with the way the story was traveling. Her palms split and healed and split again. She wrapped them in rags at night and unwrapped them each morning and went back out. It was during this stretch that the 2 men leaned on her fence and delivered the line that would follow her the rest of that year. Grief does strange things to a woman. And it was during this stretch, too, that she buried, without ceremony, 31 more jars in a single long day that left her unable to lift a coffee cup the next morning, because a boy had come by selling day-old bread and mentioned offhand that Cyrus Vane had been asking around about the Ferris note, whether anyone thought the widow could make good on it. And Adeline had understood that Cyrus wasn't asking because he was worried. He was asking because he already knew the answer and wanted witnesses to hear him say so later when he took the land. The one person who did not think she'd lost her sense was a boy of 12 named Wyatt Calloway, whose father hauled freight for the mercantile, and who had, in the way of restless boys, wandered onto Ferris land one afternoon looking for something more interesting than his own chores, and found a widow on her knees in the dirt with a shovel and 200 clay jars. He'd expected to find something to laugh about, the way the men in town laughed. Instead, he'd asked her what she was doing, plain, the way children ask, without the weight of having already decided the answer. She'd told him. All of it. The Oyas, her grandmother, the slow weep of water through porous clay, the arithmetic of 3 acres against 107, the $600, and the 6 months. She hadn't meant to tell a 12-year-old boy the whole of her situation, but there was something in his listening, unjudging and genuinely curious, that had loosened something in her chest that had been clenched since Thomas died. Wyatt had looked at the buried jars for a long moment, and then said the only word that mattered. Huh. And then he'd picked up a shovel that was leaning against the fence and started digging a hole exactly where she pointed. He came back the next day, and the day after. His father didn't much like it at first, and said so, but Wyatt was old enough to make his own choices about his afternoons, and there was something in a boy showing up day after day to help a widow no one else would help that eventually shamed the father, Silas Calloway, into riding out himself one Saturday to see what his son had gotten tangled up in. Silas was not a warm man. He hauled freight, he minded his own business, and he had exactly the amount of patience for other people's schemes that most practical men have, which is none. He stood at the edge of the 3rd acre, watching Adeline and his son work a row, and after a long silence he said, "Water table's 40 feet down out here. Everybody knows it." "I'm not drawing from the water table," Adeline said, not looking up from the jar she was settling into its hole. "I'm drawing from what falls, and holding on to it longer than the ground would on its own. Silas chewed on that. Freight haulers understood logistics, the movement of goods from where they were plentiful to where they were needed, the cost of loss along the way. He walked the row a while, looking at the buried jars, the seedlings coming up thin but green beside each one, and something in the plain mechanics of it. Not magic, not luck, just a container losing water slow instead of fast, settled into a place in his mind that respected engineering more than it respected gossip. He didn't say much else that day, but the following week he brought out a barrel of his own, one he'd been using to catch runoff at his own place, and told Adeline she could have it, and that Wyatt could keep coming by on Saturdays as long as his own chores were done first. It was not an embrace. It was the first crack in the valley's verdict, and Adeline understood exactly what it cost a man like Silas Calloway to make it. By June, the corn was up 9 inches in ground that, 30 yards outside the buried rows, was cracking into hexagonal plates from lack of moisture. Adeline had spaced her oyas with more care than she let on, testing distances on the first 50 jars before committing to the pattern for the rest, learning through her own failures. 3 jars set too shallow had cracked in a hard rain, wasting their contents in an afternoon instead of releasing it over 2 weeks. A lesson that cost her nothing but time and taught her to bury each vessel with its shoulder just below the frost line, deep enough to hold steady, shallow enough to refill by hand without breaking her back further than it was already broken. She refilled the jars every 10 to 14 days, walking the rows at dawn with 2 buckets on a yoke across her shoulders, hauling water from the one working well on the property, the shallow one near the house, that gave brackish but usable water. 40 trips some mornings, because there was no other way to do it, and she had decided a long time ago, sitting with Thomas those last 3 days, that some things simply had to be done by hand, over and over, without complaint, because complaint didn't fill a jar. Cyrus Vane rode out in July. He did not come to help. He came, he said, to see how things stood, which was his way of reminding her that the calendar was moving whether she liked it or not. He walked the edge of her green rows with his hands behind his back, taking in the sight of corn and beans and the first fat curling vines of squash in ground that by every account should have been standing empty. And something in his soft face tightened in a way that told Adeline he did not like what he was seeing, though he was careful not to say so directly. "Interesting little garden," he said instead. "Won't cover $600 though, I expect." "No," Adeline agreed. "Not yet." "The note comes due in November, Mrs. Ferris. I'd hate to see you lose the whole place over a few rows of vegetables." "Would you?" Adeline said, and left it exactly there, offering him nothing further to work with. And Cyrus had ridden off with the uncomfortable sense, which he did not examine too closely, that he had somehow lost that exchange, without being able to say how. What Cyrus did next, he did quietly, the way he did everything. He mentioned to the man who ran the feed store that he'd heard the widow Ferris was overextended and might not make her note, and the feed store man mentioned it to his customers, and within 2 weeks it had become general knowledge in town that Adeline Ferris was likely to lose the Ferris place come November, which made certain people who might otherwise have sold her seed on credit or loaned her a mule for a day's plowing, or simply been neighborly in the small ways that rural communities depend on, a good deal less willing to extend her anything at all, because nobody wanted to be left holding an obligation from a woman about to lose her land. It was not open sabotage. Cyrus Vane was too careful a man for anything so crude. It was simply the application of quiet pressure through the channels a respectable man had access to, and it worked exactly as he intended, tightening the valley's goodwill around Adeline like a slow hand closing. The Drought, meanwhile, was getting a name. By late June, the county paper, a 4-page weekly out of the county seat that Adeline read by lamplight when she could get a copy, had started running notices about it. Careful notices at first, then less careful. The Miller Creek had gone to a trickle by July. The Halloran Ranch, 40 miles east, reported losing cattle to a dry stock pond. Talk at the Mercantile turned from crops to water rights, and water rights talk in that country always eventually turned to Cyrus Vane, who held paper on 3 of the valley's 5 working wells, and who, people began to notice with growing unease, seemed remarkably unbothered by a drought that was ruining everyone around him. Adeline's corn came in end of August. Not a full crop. She'd never expected a full crop off 3 acres worked by hand with a boy's help on Saturdays and her own 2 hands the other 6 days. But a real crop. Ears filled out proper, kernels plump. In a year when the Sorensen place, 2 miles east, had planted 40 acres of corn and would harvest, when all the counting was done, barely enough to feed their own hogs through winter. She sold what corn she didn't need to keep for seed and table to a buyer out of the county seat, who was by that point paying premium prices for anything green, because green had become the rarest commodity in the valley. The corn alone cleared her $90. It was the squash and the beans that told the real story, though, because squash and beans kept, and by September, Adeline had a root cellar, dug that summer by Wyatt and Silaway together, a debt Silas insisted on repaying for the barrel she'd taken off his hands, though Adeline suspected it was less about the barrel and more about a freight hauler's growing respect for a system that worked. A root cellar filling steadily with produce in a year when most cellars in the valley stood half empty and getting emptier. The lean stretch came in September, right when it mattered most. A hard, hot wind blew 3 days straight out of the southwest, the kind of wind that pulls moisture out of everything it touches, and Adeline watched 2 rows of beans wilt despite the oyas, because even slow-release water has its limits against a wind like that. And for one long night, she sat at her kitchen table with the lamp burned low and let herself, for the first time since Thomas died, genuinely doubt whether any of it would be enough. The note was 90 days out. She had maybe $200 set aside between the corn money and what little remained of her original $211, and $600 was still $600, no matter how green her 3 acres looked against everyone else's dust. She didn't cry that night either, but she sat a long time with her hands flat on the table, feeling the cracks in her palms that hadn't fully healed since May. And she thought about her grandmother, Refugio, who had buried oyas in ground twice as dry as this, in a country that made this valley look generous, and had fed a family of 9 off it for 30 years without ever once, as far as Adeline knew, doubting at her own kitchen table in the middle of the night. In the morning, she got up and refilled the jars. That was the whole of her answer to doubt. She got up and did the work again. By October, word of the Ferris place had started to travel differently. It was Wyatt, mostly, who carried the change. A boy talking at school about the widow's green rose, about the buried jars, about how his father had started using 2 of them himself along the edge of his own kitchen garden and gotten tomatoes that outlasted everyone else's on the street. Children repeat what they hear at home without the filters adults apply, and so the story that reached the schoolyard was cleaner than the story that had circulated at the Mercantile, less about grief, more about a trick that worked, and it began, slowly, to shift how people spoke of Adeline when her name came up. Beulah rode out again in October, this time not worried but curious, and stood at the edge of the 3 green acres with an expression Adeline hadn't seen on her sister-in-law's face since before Thomas died. Something like wonder, mixed with the particular discomfort of realizing you'd misjudged someone you loved. "I told people you'd lost your sense," Beulah admitted, quiet, not looking at Adeline directly. "I'm sorry for it." "You believed what everyone believed," Adeline said. "I'm not going to hold a grudge against common sense for being wrong once." It was as close to forgiveness as either of them needed, and Beulah left that day with a sack of squash and a promise to send her own husband out to see about buying jars from old Esteban Vidal for their own place, which was, in its way, the valley's verdict beginning to turn, one household at a time, well before the harder proof arrived. The harder proof arrived in the third week of October, and it arrived in the form of a county assayer named Horace Pruitt, sent out from the county seat at the request of a newspaper editor who'd heard enough repeated stories about the widow's buried jars to think there might be an actual article in it, something to run alongside the increasingly grim drought coverage, a note of ingenuity in a season of loss. Horace Pruitt was not a sentimental man. He measured soil moisture with instruments, took samples at various depths across Adeline's 3 acres, and, for comparison, across a fallow section of her own unplanted land 20 yards distant, and wrote his findings up plain. Moisture retention in the Oya-irrigated rows measured nearly 4 times what it measured in unirrigated ground at the same depth, at a fraction of the water volume used in conventional furrow irrigation elsewhere in the county. He did not editorialize. He simply reported what his instruments told him, and the numbers did the rest of the talking. The article ran the last week of October under a modest headline, but it ran with Horace Pruitt's numbers printed plain in a little box beside the text, and a county starving for any good news at all read it hungrily, and by the following market day, half the valley had heard some version of "the widow's jars actually work, and there's a man from the county who measured it and says so." That was the moment, more than any other, that the story in Adeline's favor stopped being a story people told about a strange woman and started being a story people told about a method. Because numbers, unlike gossip, don't care who's telling them. And numbers had just spoken plainly in Adeline's favor for the whole valley to read. Cyrus Vane read the article too. He was not a stupid man, and he understood immediately what it meant for his plans regarding the Ferris place, namely, that a widow who 6 months earlier had been assumed to be losing her sense was now being written up in the county paper as having outsmarted a drought that was ruining half his other debtors, and that calling in her note now, with public opinion turning the way it was turning, would look considerably worse for him than it would have looked in June. He wrote out to the Ferris place a second time in early November, this time with an offer instead of a warning. He would extend the note another year, he said, generously. No additional interest, seeing as you've clearly got a system that's working out here. Adeline had listened to the whole of his offer standing in her own yard, arms folded, saying nothing until he'd finished. Then she'd told him she appreciated the offer but wouldn't need it, because she intended to pay the note in full, on time, in November, as originally agreed. Cyrus had not expected that answer. His smooth face had done something complicated for just a moment before smoothing back over, and he'd asked, careful, whether she was quite certain, given that $600 was still $600. "I've got the corn money, the squash and bean sales, and a standing order from a buyer in the county seat for everything my cellar can spare through winter," Adeline said. "I did the arithmetic in May, Mr. Vane, same as I'm doing it now. It comes out the same both times." He left without the satisfaction he'd come for, and word of that exchange, Cyrus Vane riding out to offer generous terms and being turned down flat by a widow who intended to pay in full, traveled through the valley faster than anything else had all year, because there is nothing a small community enjoys retelling quite so much as the moment a powerful man's generosity is revealed to be unnecessary. The market day that mattered most came the second Saturday of November, cold and clear. The whole county turned out because word had spread that the Ferris seller was selling off its surplus, and prices on anything green had climbed high enough that people were traveling from 3 towns over to buy. Adeline set up a modest stall, a plank table and 2 barrels for legs, nothing fancy, and laid out squash, dried beans, strings of onions, jars of preserves she'd put up through October nights when her hands were too tired for anything but sitting and stirring a pot. The same 2 men who'd leaned on her fence in October the year before, watching her bury barrels and calling it grief, came through the market that morning, same as everyone else, and they stopped at her stall, and the taller one picked up a squash and turned it over in his hands, admiring the weight of it, before he looked up and recognized who was selling it. There was a silence. Not a long one, but a real one, the kind the narrator can tell you contained a great deal. An apology neither man quite had the words for, a recalculation of everything they'd assumed about a woman on her knees in the dirt with a shovel and 200 broken jars. The taller man set the squash back down, gentle, and then picked it back up again, and this time he reached for his coin purse instead. "How much?" he said, and it wasn't really a question about the squash. By noon, Adeline's stall had sold out entirely. By the following week, Esteban Vidal had sold his entire remaining stock of clay jars, every seconds and cracked piece he'd been ready to smash for scrap the previous spring, to 7 different families across the valley, who decided that whatever the widow Ferris was doing, they wanted to be doing it too before the next dry season came. He raised his price on new jars a little, not out of greed, but because demand had simply outpaced what one old potter working 1 kiln could produce. And even at the higher price, orders kept coming. Adeline paid Cyrus Vane the full $600 on the 15th of November, in the mercantile, in front of witnesses, counting it out in cash onto his own counter. She did not gloat. She did not say a single word beyond what was necessary to conduct the transaction and request her paid note marked satisfied, which he did, his soft face giving away nothing, though everyone in that mercantile that day understood exactly what had just happened, and exactly what it meant, and exactly how it compared to what he'd been quietly hoping for back in June. "Pleasure doing business," Cyrus said, because there was nothing else left for him to say, and Adeline said only, "Good day, Mr. Vane," and walked out into the cold with her paid note folded in her coat pocket and her chin exactly as level as it had been the day of Thomas's funeral, because she had never once, through the whole of it, let the valley's opinion tell her who she was. The winter that followed was not easy. No winter on the frontier ever was, but it was a winter with a full cellar, with a barn Silas Calloway helped her patch before the first snow, with Wyatt coming by most Saturdays still, less to help now than simply because he'd become a fixture of the place, and Adeline had become, without either of them quite naming it, something like family to a boy whose own mother had died young. The gentle companionship that eventually bloomed for Adeline came slower and later than any of that, arriving the following spring in the shape of a quiet, sun-weathered man named Elias Boone, who ran cattle on leased land to the south, and who had first come to her stall that November market day not because he needed squash, but because he'd heard about the jars and wanted to ask a serious technical question about spacing and depth, and had stood there for 20 minutes asking her serious questions while his cattle waited, patient, on the far side of the square. He respected the work before he ever noticed the woman doing it, which was, in the end, exactly the kind of respect Adeline had spent a hard year teaching an entire valley to give her. The following season, Adeline expanded her buried rows to 11 acres, and other families across the valley, having watched what one widow accomplished with 200 broken jars and a stubborn refusal to explain herself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation, began digging in their own oyas along their own gardens, until the trick that had once been called grief became, within 3 years, simply how you grew a garden in that country when the rains ran short, which in that country, it turned out, was most years. The valley recalibrated itself around her, the way valleys eventually do around anyone proven right by results instead of argument. Quietly, without much ceremony. Prices at the mercantile adjusting, invitations extending, the two men at the fence rail becoming, in time, two of her more reliable customers, neither of whom ever again used the word grief in connection with anything Adeline Ferris did with her own 110 acres of land.
So here, at the end of it, is what I'd leave with you, whoever you are, wherever this valley of a story has found you tonight. The world prices things once, quick, off the top, and moves on. Worthless, it says, broken, done, grief. But the land prices things every season, honestly, off what they actually produce, and it does not care in the least what the world decided first. Adeline Ferris was not saved by luck, and she was not saved by anyone's charity, and she was certainly not saved by the drought itself, though the drought is what finally let the whole valley see what had been true about her all along. She was saved by 200 broken jars nobody else wanted, an old trick her grandmother taught her before the world told her which parts of herself to keep quiet, and a willingness to be misjudged for 6 long months without once needing to argue her case out loud. If there is dry ground in your own life right now, a plan someone's called foolish, a hope you've buried quietly because you got tired of explaining it to people who'd only tell you it was wrong. I hope you'll remember her, on her knees in the dirt in October, digging a hole for a jar nobody else believed in. Keep filling it, keep refilling it, 10 days at a time, however tired your hands get. The green doesn't show up all at once. But when the drought finally comes, and in every life some kind of drought always comes, it will show you, plain as ridge to ridge, exactly what you were growing all along. Go gently this week, and I'll see you back here again soon, with another story worth the hour.